you've played a game of Fortnite, you've probably stayed away from the storm as much as possible. But in Season 2's FNCS Grand Finals, the biggest tournament of the season with $2 million on the line, around 50% of the entire lobby was just playing inside of the storm and not actually inside of the safe circle. Now, to understand this, you first need to understand how zone damages actually work. Very importantly, for the first 5 storm circles, the storm actually only deals 1 damage per second, aka 1 tick. And if you look at the timings of these, that's basically the first 16 minutes of the match is all just 1 damage per second. Then in the 6th zone, it deals 2 damage per second, which you can still easily survive. But after that, in the 7th zone, it deals 5 damage per second, which is difficult. Then it goes to an 8 tick. And then for all of the moving zones, the storm will deal 10 damage to you per second, which is very difficult to survive. Now, you can't just stay in the storm for the entire game because there's a mechanic called Storm Sickness, which activates once the storm has dealt 600 damage to you total. What essentially happens is it then triples the amount of damage that the storm is doing. So if you get Storm Sickness in the end game where it deals 10 damage per second, it actually deals 30 damage per second, which basically will just kill you instantly. Even if you manage to somehow out-heal this due to a bug, once you get to 1000 damage dealt, you just instantly die. So there is a limit on how long players can play for the storm. But pros have figured out that that's a long time. Because the first 5 zones are all 1 tick, aka they deal 1 damage per second, this means you can survive 600 seconds in there before Storm Sickness is activated, which is 10 minutes. So if you can just safely survive in a 1 tick storm for 10 minutes, healing using campfires, med mists, and med kits, then it's no surprise that at any given moment there's a huge percentage of players in the storm. So in your mind, you may be thinking, wow, these guys can just skip 10 minutes of a 26-minute game. Now, that sounds kind of stupid, but in reality, that's not actually how this works at all. Pro players can't just sit in the storm and do nothing because, well, they'll die to Storm Surge. Players who've dealt the least damage will take damage back from Storm Surge at these points throughout the game. There are more than these amount of players alive at that moment. So this is where it gets interesting, because if they spend more than 10 minutes in the storm, they will die to Storm Sickness, but also whilst they're in the storm, they're more than likely not racking up a huge amount of Storm Surge damage and then will die to Storm Surge. So how is it possible that 4 of the top 10 teams used a strategy where they played as much storm as possible? Let's look at the first game of EU where Queasy, Swizzy, and Moustache managed to win the game whilst doing this strategy. They land at Seaport City, and all 3 of them grab a little bit of loot and a little bit of materials, and then Swizzy and Moustache build a huge surge tower to the south on top of the hill, intentionally building this towards the teams south of them. There are 4 different teams all the way surrounding them: Shark and Noah to their west, Blaha to their east, Thomas HD and Uppel to their southeast, and then Ferdoxy and Pablo to their south. So in extremely boring surge trading fashion, Swizzy and Moustache sit up on this tower and just repeatedly tag these players over and over and over and over again, whilst Queasy stays in the PY, grabs a bunch of loot, grabs a bunch of materials, and transfers all of those extra heals up to Swizzy and Moustache so that they have all of the additional heals up there, so when they're taking damage back from other players, they can just keep healing over and over again. He also piles all of the extra white heals and big pots and launch pads into the center of their drop spot for later. So by the time the 3rd zone pops up, they've dealt over 1,190 damage, which in this game actually would have been enough damage to do them up until the 8th zone. So they basically didn't have to worry about Storm Surge for the rest of the game. This is called surge trading, which is extremely controversial because the teams who are trading back and forth with each other are racking up an insane amount of Storm Surge damage. Now imagine you're in this lobby. You're trying to fight random teams or tag people on rotates to rack up as much damage as possible. But players aren't going to rotate past you because they're all surge trading in different areas of the map. So you have no one to shoot, and if you do shoot them, you're not going to get anywhere near as much damage as the teams who are trading. So in this lobby, if you're not trading, you're not trying, and you'll more than likely die to Storm Surge. I'm not calling anyone out here. It's basically the evolution of the meta, and I think it's up to Epic to actually change Storm Surge, but that's a whole other conversation. But now, because they've dealt so much Storm Surge damage, they could now just sit and play Storm for basically as long as they want until it's dealt 600 damage to them, meaning they're staying away from all of the danger of the other players for a considerable amount of time. In this game, they only decide to to stay here for one single zone, meaning they only really need to waste a single med miss once they get into the safe circle, but from here they ended up taking height and winning this game. But you can see by getting a lot of Storm Surge damage early, you are then safe to play into the storm because there's not the pressure of Storm Surge. But why would you even want to play in the storm anyway? Well, let's take the third game from Queasy as a good example because you already understand their strategy. They do the exact same thing, but a team rotates into their POI whilst they're in the storm, resulting in them spending a lot of time here fighting. Once they have wiped them out, they now are the furthest team away from the safe circle, and they're now into the 6th zone, which, as you remember, is a 2-tick. They jump in the teleporter port potty and then use a gold splash alongside their bats to sprint the entire rotate, using a few med mists to make sure they get into the zone. Now, these partial rotates waste a ton of your materials since there's so many people around you who shoot and spray you as you rotate, so you have to build to protect yourself. But by going through the storm like Queasy's team did, well, there's less people there, which means there's less people shooting you, so they saved tons of materials. By the time they popped out into the 6th zone, they had the second highest amount of materials of any team, which sets them up really nicely for the rest of the zones after that. So basically, playing the storm saves you a ton of mats. Now, as I mentioned in there, Queasy team used this porta potty to get through half of that rotate. However, there are a lot of really interesting other mobility aspects that other teams are using to rotate when they're trying this exact same strategy. There are a lot of really useful things that players want to carry in their inventory, and you'd think that launch pads would be one of them. However, for the endgame, they're honestly just not really that good, and they're just not worth taking in an inventory slot. So a lot of players who are playing through the storm have pads set up one after another that they can continually rotate on, which allows them to get out of the storm faster. Doxy's team also sometimes went for the armored truck, which they parked underneath their Storm Surge tower. Since they land at Mast Meadows, they can then use the gold they got from the vault here to go into the black market, buy themselves a bunch of heals, which allows them to stay alive in the storm, then just drive themselves through the storm. They also used the big geyser. Now, what most people don't know about the big geyser is that if you hit it twice, you actually end up going way further. So you can see here, as they fly up into the sky, they then let themselves sink back down, but as the geyser hits them again, they go even higher, which allows them to rotate straight into the next zone. Doxy also swam outside of this zone in game number 5 as well, so there are a ton of different ways that the best players are actually rotating out of the storm safely. Now, if you've been a little observant or you actually watched the first day of this tournament, you'll notice that 6 of the 6 zones all pulled to the north. So the few example games I've given so far are when the zones pull to the far north, which obviously benefits the teams who land in the north because they don't have to rotate far and then have no need to play storm. In game 2, as a good example, Vanya, Marius, and Pixie, who won, basically stayed in flooded frogs the entire time. They were able just to stand here and trade surge for the vast majority of the game, meaning they didn't have to worry about this at all. Similarly, Exuis, Archskull, and Podesai, who land to the west of them, also didn't really have to move from their surge base until the storm actually caught up with them in the 5th zone, where they decided just to stay there. And because they pulled a good 6th zone rotate, they could just waltz into the dead side of this and then just had great positioning away from everyone else. Out of the 6 games on day 1, 5 of the 6 were won by teams who landed in the north. So because half of the lobby is storm surge trading, when all of the day 1 zones pull to the north teams are more likely to win the match because of the easier rotates and the fact that they've already got their storm surge ticked off. And then the south teams end up playing in the storm because of the far zones. But what's really interesting about this is that a lot of teams had built-in counters to this meta. On NA, Peterbot keyed Clix's team to the north of them. However, because they usually grab the medallion from the train, this shows their location on the map, and it's usually Peterbot who carries this. However, in this instance, they gave it to Ritual, who just waited at the black market to the southwest. This means that when Clix's team looked on their map, they didn't know that they were actually getting snuck up on because Pete was already underneath Higgs. And because Higgs, Eomzo, and Clix take a massive split, this actually left him isolated and by himself. So as soon as he beams Higgs, Cold follows through, and now it's a 1v2 where they easily are able to wipe out Higgs. And again, since they were split, Clix takes a long time to get back to Higgs, and by the time they get together, he's already dead, which then means he's then being jumped by 3 players and he also goes down. But most interestingly was Vino, Flixie, and Vico, who played a very interesting kind of TD strat where they change drops almost every single game. Knowing the loop paths and rotations of other teams, they would camp on specific parts of the map, similar to the way Tini would, so they could elim one player from the team, and then they would take over that team's strategy in some of the matches. So in game 5, for example, they'd clearly studied Queasy's strategy and camped the vault waiting for one player to go inside of it. Then once Swizzy was inside of the vault, all 3 of them just jumped him, wiped him out, and then also wiped out Murstache, leaving Queasy left as a solo. Then that exact same surge strategy we talked about earlier, they just did that strategy and played the game out from there. So this strategy is insanely good. Fordoxi's team actually took the most storm damage total, being 14,890, meaning on average they took 400 damage of storm each every single game. But due to the strategy, they actually didn't take a single tick of storm surge damage throughout all 12 of the matches, which unsurprisingly led them to a second place finish. But Vanya, Marius, and Pixie, who won the tournament and are now FNCS champions, did not use this strategy at all. In fact, their strategy benefited from everyone playing in the storm. On average, each player from the team took 230 damage for Storm, which is almost half of that of Fordoxi's team. Now, we talked a lot about the favorable north zones, and for them landing flooded frogs, this is obviously extremely beneficial as they don't really have to rotate much, and I already mentioned they can trade Surge a bunch. But the final two games on day 2, they're actually incredibly good performances for them, and they were nowhere near their drop spot. So they start this game off by trading Surge, mainly to the west of their drop spot, and as that third zone pulls in, most of the other teams would sit and play the Storm at this minute, get a bunch of heals, and then rotate late. But what Vanya's team decides to do is the complete opposite. Rather than sitting and tanking Storm, they immediately rotate to try get a relatively centered position on every single mid-game zone. If you notice, as they make these rotates, they're relatively free, and the reason is because everybody is playing Storm. That means there's half the players in the actual safe circle, so if they decide to rotate early, they can almost always guarantee a good position. And then all of these players will rotate later behind them, and they can just sit and hold them and rack up a bunch of Storm Surge damage. And then, because they've not taken as much Storm damage, they can play the zone in the end game, since unlike the other teams, they won't die to Storm Sickness. In this particular game, they get an Elim onto a team at the backside and refresh their materials, and then they chuck down a Med Mist, and then start ramping up from behind and are able to take height away from Vino, who isn't paying attention to this angle. From there, they're able to win the game, and overall, they actually managed to win 4 of the 12 games, which is incredibly impressive across the whole weekend. Now, there are a lot of strange little quirks with the zone and how it works, but if you want to learn why 93.8% of players stay below this line over here, you can click on this video on screen right now.